One of my favorite underlying points that I've used about a dozen times on this show is that we know nothing about the things that we know the most about. This paradox exists since you can only understand what something is based upon its underlying context. Thus, if you exist too close to something, you can't look at it objectively, given you don't have enough distance to see it for what it's not. An easy example of this I think a lot of you would know from your daily lives is that you can be in a toxic romantic relationship without even realizing it, since you're so close to your partner. This is very true of anthropology today. That's since human societies are absolutely insane across the world and history. The more you look at how we humans organize ourselves, it's just incredibly fascinating. Between the Aztecs doing millions of human sacrifices to please the sun god, how many Islamic states had princes who were slaves, the West's ability to make godlike technologies, or the Prophet Muhammad showing up and making the biggest empire in history up to that point out of nothing. It's just remarkable that it's all real. Furthermore, our society today is possibly the most absurd society ever in history. On top of this, there are so many very rapid social changes occurring right now that no one ever talks about. There's so much material to talk about anthropology if we put the slightest amount of effort into it. However, our society has no interest in how societies work. We believe pretty stupid ideas that were never tested, like the blank slate that human nature is all social engineering and is naturally good. Alternately, that all cultures work the same, and men and women are the same as well, and that culture is unimportant. This is so stupid, and people don't even realize how stupid it is. With all of this being said, we never study our own society anthropologically. What I once said to a friend is the reason we don't look for lessons in history is we know that if we found them, that we would be doing it really wrong, and we don't want to be held accountable. However, if we did the slightest amount of digging, we would find fascinating results from studying the anthropology of our culture. This is the first video of a two-part series. The next video that will immediately follow this one is on the anthropology of the right. We will be studying the right and the left as if we were looking at tribal peoples in the Amazon or the Congo. In this video, looking at the origins, strengths, weaknesses, and character of the left as a cultural formation. I can promise you the results will surprise you. Unfortunately, mainstream media is dominated by liberal voices while conservative views tend to be suppressed. This makes finding unbiased news tough and attention for right-wing concerns almost impossible. Thankfully, Ground News helps me sort this out. Ground News isn't a news outlet. It's an app and website that pulls in related coverage from thousands of news sources so you can see how the same story is being covered across the political spectrum. Every story comes with a breakdown of each source's political bias and ownership so you can see how these factors affect how they frame the news. For example, let's dive into Texas's decision to remove over 1 million voters from its rolls. Ground News found more than 70 articles covering this with barely any reporting coming from liberal sources. Of the ones that are reporting on this, NBC is calling this move a chilling message, while The Independent seems to hint at voter suppression. But on the right, the Epoch Times emphasizes Texas's removed non-citizens and deceased to prevent any fraud. I really like their blind spot feed where you'll find more stories the left are covering, like California lawmakers passing a bill that could make undocumented immigrants eligible for home loans. News like this can really change the outcome of elections and trajectory of this country, but only if you're aware of it. Go to grounds.news/whatif or scan my QR code on screen to see what else mainstream media isn't showing you. My viewers save 40% on the same plan I use for unlimited access to all their features. Not only would you be supporting my work, you'd also be supporting an independent platform that respects conservative views. I've worked with Ground News for years, and I can legitimately say that they are a good service which I actually do use. Part 1. What is left? I want to make it clear, and I think you folks already know this mostly, but I clearly have a dog in this fight. I'm known for being a conservative pundit who has said some negative things about the left in the past. First of all, finding a person without a political axe to grind today is nigh impossible. Even when centrists show up and try to openly be as centrist as physically possible, they get shoehorned in by the left and the culture in general into being part of the conservative coalition. Studies have found that the demographic breakdown of the population in America is 1/3 conservative, 1/3 leftist, and 1/3 politically inactive. They found in said study the apoliticals weren't principled political centrists, but rather anti-intellectual normie idiots. Secondly, what matters more than the political dog racing is the truth. If something is the truth, it's just the truth. You can stop there. If someone says something true, it doesn't matter what their motivations are or how they reach their conclusion. What matters is that they won the race to the finish line. Being fair isn't 50-50, an ideal our society sometimes pretends to, but we don't commit to. Being fair is saying the truth for what it is. The fact that we're operating off any other principle in direct opposition to the West's intellectual heritage since the ancient world is a sign that we are a society that the left has already completely changed. We operate under a leftist philosophic worldview in a level where, at this point, even conservatives are working inside the left's logic. There's a book by Tom Holland called Dominion, and it's about how much Christianity influenced the modern world in every conceivable way you could possibly imagine. I made a previous video on this topic if people are interested. What Holland says is that Christianity has influenced the world so much so that even people who are purposely anti-Christian end up becoming indirectly Christian through taking Christianity's assumptions about the world without even thinking about it. The irony is that the anti-Christian left does this given the values of the meek being good, equality, progress, and utopia all stem from Christian thinking. We forget this, but go to India, China, or the Roman Empire, and they didn't believe any of that stuff. I'm going to argue here that leftism is what Christianity was to the whole of history is to the modern world. We fundamentally exist in a leftist world today. Every single thing someone says, the way they see the world, and even how the right acts is all based on leftist philosophy. There is basically nothing in our world today that is not leftist. In the same way that Christianity permeated the Western mind so much that you struggle to find anything that is at least not somewhat Christian. I think our world is so colored by leftist assumptions that we are all leftists. One of my friends likes to say, the future is whatever the left says. People can't conceptualize anything except the left's future of progress, social engineering, and equality. The right merely rejects this future, yearning for a past that never really existed, while the left are the only people with a comprehensive direction for tomorrow, even if it's an incredibly delusional view of the future. Let me use myself as an example. I am well known for being a libertarian rightist, which is the exact opposite of Marxism. However, I see Marx's influence on my ideas a lot. Marx was the first guy to look at the patterns in history to predict the future, which is what I do. Class analysis, something Marx invented, is something I do all the time and is a trademark for me vis-a-vis other intellectuals in the space. Marx talked a lot of the contradictions of the current ideological system and why there was an inevitable revolution that would form around an ideology that he has developed. Guess who predicts that there's going to be a revolution against the ideological contradictions of the current society while proposing a new ideology and a manifesto? Even while being his opposite in many ways, Marx still has a huge influence on me. Thomas Sowell has made a really fascinating point that's really stuck with me. He said in the modern world that what the left is clear, and whatever is not the left is the right. That the right basically shares no features across its coalition. When you look at the left, you see Marxist-derived ideologies which believe in a unified technocracy based around equality of all people, social engineering used to bring about utopia, wealth redistribution done through the state, the blank slate, among other things. That being said, when you look at the right, you find the Taliban, libertarians, Nazis, monarchists, Confucians, neocons, militarists, religious fundamentalists, and boomer cons, which are all shoved into the same box. These people really share nothing except support for some sense of tradition and opposition to the left's worldview. Mind you, in fighting against the left, they often develop similarities, as I said before, including some preferring to an older social order, even if the left has become the new status quo. What's been going on here is that the left has a shared proposition that they've been trying to conquer the world with for the last 200 years. Meanwhile, whoever happens to be in that place in that time who fights them, whether in World War II Germany with the Nazis, modern Afghanistan with the Taliban, or modern America with the Republicans, are whatever the right is positionally. The last 200 years have been the global battle between the right and the left. You see it as early as the French Revolution, then 1848, the World Wars, communism, and now the culture wars today. The amount of sheer ideological difference between leftism that happened during the French Revolution and modern wokeness is not that big. I've read a couple interesting books which compare the things radicals in the French Revolution said to the modern left, and it's really interesting. Ironically, the Marquis de Sade, who, as we all know, was a really nice guy, spoke about the depersonalization and the alienation that would come about from the sexual revolution, or human life, in a way that seems perfectly in touch with the most hedonic factions of the left today. If you want this explained better, read this text wall. The best book on this topic, although one that's admittedly difficult to read, is Fire in the Minds of Men by Billington. I'm going to reference it a lot for this video. It's a book on the 19th century origins of the modern left. He talks about how French thinkers in the 1820s like Saint-Simon talk about how we needed mass migration and liberation from the third world, which would cause a war of liberation to free the first world. He wanted to create a priesthood of the science, which would create secular religion to honor the discoveries of science. He wanted to create a new man, interchangeable from old cultural ties, and to have complete androgeneity between the sexes, pushing for something that sounds like trans. Every single thing in the modern left can be found in French thinkers 200 years ago, like Saint-Simon. In my opinion, he's one of the most underrated historical figures. Between the 30 Years' War and the French Revolution, Western civilization was stuck in a conflict between Britain or France, that being underlined by capitalism versus mercantilism. From the Black Death until the 30 Years' War, it was Protestants versus Catholics. Before then, from the collapse of the Frankish Empire until the Black Death, the largest ideological struggle inside Western civilization was between the Catholic Church and secular authorities like the Holy Roman Emperor. These kinds of divides are completely normal over history, with other examples being the Optimates versus the Populares in the fall of the Roman Republic, or the Armagnacs and Burgundians in 14th century France. In each case, these ideological battles overlay some ethnic, regional, or class interest where ideology rationalizes it. As I frequently say, people just like killing each other and make up reasons to do it. Over the course of this video, we will explain what the underlying social, ethnic, economic, and psychological drives behind the modern left are. I think a lot of you guys will find this application of anthropological techniques normally used on other cultures when applied to the modern world fun. It's actually pretty easy to put all the pieces together, but y'all have to wait a second. What I will say is that there are two lefts over history. There is the Western left and the Eastern left. This is an idea I've developed myself when I looked at the history of leftism. I think Western left is the line from Rousseau through the French Revolution, then into Bohemian culture, Weimar, the 1960s, and now with wokeness. Meanwhile, Eastern leftism starts with Karl Marx, then Lenin, Stalin, and Mao, and now with the Chinese Communist Party. The Western left is more libertine, feminine, delusional, anarchic, gay, and green. The Eastern left is masculine, authoritarian, aggressive, statist, and direct. I actually think it's useful to study them as completely different movements, since they seem to be operating off different trajectories. I've already made a video on the Eastern bloc of leftism, that being the communism video. I've purposely tried to put different content in each video, and so there's lots of stuff I'm leaving out about the Western left, which you should watch that video to know on a deeper basis. branches. Thus, this video will focus on the Western branch, or basically the Western leftists that we see fighting over the culture wars today. Antifa and BIPOC, not Lenin and Deng Xiaoping. The theme which we subtly teased out earlier, that the left can determine what is socially acceptable today, should be an important tell, which we'll gradually answer later. I think this is a really fascinating topic to cover, given what the left shows as its face and what's really happening under the hood are so different. The irony, and this is a feature, not a bug, is that what the left says they are and the truth are so different as to basically be opposites. Over the course of this video, we will look at the demographics, philosophy, and psychology of the left. Part 2, Demographics. One of the tweets of mine that went the most viral, which got over 1 million views, was when I said, I don't think the Jews are to blame for the left. Rather, I blame the Jews and women, Calvinists, and the bureaucracy. I think for each of these, they share some of the blame. As we will get into later, I'm going to throw in another group who were decisive to the formation of the left, the French. Although the French importance has shrunk over time, historically we have the illusion of knowing what the story is. The problem of writing about the present versus writing about the past is that we knew what happens afterwards. When you read enough about a particular era of history, you realize that people at the time were worried about 1 million different trajectories that just didn't happen. The feared Russian conquest of Europe in the mid-19th century, the French invasion of England, or a communist revolution in America, all of which serious people worried about. However, we can know what did or didn't happen in the past. For example, when I talk about historic conflicts, I can often distill it into a single variable. The parliamentarians versus the royalists in the English Civil War were bourgeoisie capitalists against the old gentry and nobility. The whites versus the red in the Russian Civil War was the Russian heartland around Moscow versus the fringes. The American Civil War was the slave-owning South versus the industrial North. There are at least 4 separate correlative trends that you can use to predict the demographics of the left. These are 4 separate trends that stack up almost perfectly onto the other, in America at least. I know things are kind of different in Europe. Those being cities versus countryside, managerial versus merchant class, low agency versus high agency, and female versus male. To explain all of these, if you look at a map of red states versus blue states, it's very clearly an urban versus rural map. The blue states are the states with the huge international cities. Places like New York City, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, or Chicago. Chicago is a great example of this, in that in almost all cases, the rural areas of blue states, like downstate Illinois, upstate New York, or the Central Valley of California, are conservative. Meanwhile, cities in red states like Austin, Dallas, Kansas City, or Atlanta are blue. On a statistical basis, the strongest correlation by a significant margin for whether someone is conservative or progressive is that conservatives would rather live outside a town to have a larger house with more land, and leftists would rather live closer to the action and have a smaller home. This is an almost perfect urban versus rural proxy. The beautiful thing about the world is that there are multiple layers of causation always happening at once. The anthropological nature of cities establishes incentives in which you naturally see something like leftism show up. An important fact to keep in mind is that only since the Industrial Revolution do we see majority urban populations. I talk about this theme more so in my video on population collapse, but cities are anthropologically different in that, for example, ever since the ancient world, cities have always been incapable of demographically sustaining themselves without countrysides. On top of this, cities have always historically been atheist or agnostic and have been places of creativity and also moral degeneracy. This is since inside cities you can't use social ties to maintain moral standards. Humans evolved to live in small communities in which everyone knew everyone else. Cities remove that, thus allowing them to be creative systems which can produce lots of cool stuff, but at the expense of social stability. Keep in mind that there were certain people who had value systems roughly similar to the modern left in the pre-industrial world, but they tended to be cosmopolitan aristocrats. People like some Italian Renaissance humanist thinkers, Tolstoy, Marquis de Sade, or some ancient Greek thinkers like Epicurus. The reason there aren't that many parallels to the left in pre-industrial societies, in which almost every society before the Industrial Revolution is in the authoritarian right box of the political compass, is that all pre-industrial societies were rural. You can also map this correlation in that France was the first country in Europe which urbanized, building its entire elite around Paris due to the centralized monarchy. Thus, France was the first country in Europe to experience leftism or agnosticism, that being the French Revolution. After this, you can correlate the rise of socialism with urbanization, as you can see from this text wall. The other correlations make sense from looking at the urban-rural split. This is why the founding fathers of the left were all French. I am going to keep recommending the book Fire in the Minds of Men by Billington, but the entire first generation of leftist thinkers were all French. An interesting side note here is that modern socialism came out of various sub-factions in the French Revolution. Inside the chaotic maelstrom that was leftist French revolutionary politics, the different political factions were literally made up of people who went to different cafes. Thus, you could map different factions of radicals based on the streets that the cafes they went to were. France had a 50-year demographic lead on the rest of Europe, which is a trend that goes back to the Middle Ages. What that means is that France consistently hits overpopulation 50 years earlier than the rest of Europe. This also explains why in the early 19th century, leftism jumped to Germany, Italy, and Poland after originating in France. Once those societies experienced population booms, this fusion is what created communism, or the eastern branch of leftism, as Marx was a Jew from the German Rhineland. If you look at a map of the modern Western left, or a subvariety which I colloquially call WEFism from the World Economic Forum, is that it almost perfectly maps onto Calvinism. Calvinism was a sect of Protestantism which believed that humans were born in sin and that most would be cast into hell, which we had no control over due to divine predestination. Calvinism was strong in the Netherlands, Scotland, Eastern England, southwestern France, the German Rhineland, Switzerland, or Berlin. After that, they populated the American Northeast, who in turn populated the Pacific Northwest, or English-speaking Canada. If you compare the areas that supports modern globalist ideologies like the World Economic Forum or wokeness to Calvinism, it's literally just the same map. Calvinism involves a theocratic, educated elite, much like the professors who dominate wokeism. Calvinism had a small anointed caste who had to fight on in a sinful world. This was so similar to the modern left's vision of the world that Thomas Sowell titled his book on the leftist view of the world, The Vision of the Anointed. The concept of castes, of the saved and sinners, also fits very closely with the modern woke creation of a racial caste system of oppression. Calvinists are also predisposed to messianism, or an attempt to build a utopia, or, as they called it in New England, a shining city on a hill. Calvinist societies pushed for equality, standardization, and state intervention to very strict levels. It was the 17th century's equivalent to the nanny state, in which you were fined for arguing with your wife too loudly. If you're interested in this topic, check out my videos on American regional cultures. There's also a different argument that the Quakers, another British Protestant sect, founded modern leftism, which, even though I am a Pennsylvania Quaker, I partly see, but I don't think it's the underlying cause. The Quakers pushed for women's rights, full suffrage, and the abolition of slavery. However, you look at the Quaker diaspora in both England and America, where they went for libertarianism and hyper-capitalism. Quakers pushed for classical liberalism or freedom of choice, while never going through social engineering. The soft-heartedness of the left and a lot of the ideas comes from the Quakers, though, but then it disseminated to other groups who actually pushed it. Then there's the popular argument that the modern left is founded by the Jews. Again, like all of the other arguments here, there is a strong element of truth. What I will say is that none of these groups are really responsible in that the left formed as an organic whole, incorporating discrete elements into its own thing. Jews have had a vastly disproportionate element in the creation of the modern left. This is especially pronounced in certain sub-regions and eras. For example, almost all of the postmodernist thinkers were Jews. Mid-century America, the rise of communism in Russia, or the Weimar era were also also very disproportionately Jewish. In my opinion, Kevin MacDonald and Kurt Doolittle are the people who have made the best arguments for the Jewish element in the left. Basically, that you can trace certain parts of leftist philosophy either towards a Jewish self-interest to protect themselves from nationalist governments, which have very frequently targeted them, or that the left is a projection of certain elements of Jewish society and philosophy. The Jews have always cared a lot about social cohesion and welfare inside their own communities. The Jews also have a bent towards messianic thinking that they are on the edge of reaching utopia, and if they are morally good, God will reward them with victory or confusing the good for the truth. Jewish culture also has an idea of criticism in which the prophets would do social criticism of the ills of society. Even though there is an element of truth, I think this argument gets pushed too far all the time. There are a couple counterpoints to also look at. The first is that the Jews are vastly disproportionate in literally everything, including the far right. Jews are only 1.5% of America's population and less of Europe's. I am of British and Irish ancestry, and I have lots of hyper left-wing relatives. It seems strange to think the Jews just brainwashed most white Western women. Wouldn't it make more sense if the Jews happened to supply ideas that fed into white women's self-interests? The problem is that if you factor the Jews into being the left, the equation just doesn't add up. You have too many ecosystems that had basically no Jews and yet still had the left. Look at China, the Spanish Civil War, Stalin purging the Jews from the Soviet Union, or why is Israel so conservative politically? The irony is that the Jews in politics tend to be moderate leftists, in that the people like Sam Harris, Steven Pinker, Saad Gad, Konstantin Kizin, Brett Weinstein, among others, tend to be the moderates. The raving insane people on the left are either our BIPOC brothers or white Anglos or other Europeans. If you removed all Jews from the West today, the left would just get crazier, given the Jews are a moderating force on the left. You would still have over 100 million white radical leftists. Ironically, this is proven by the left turning on the Jews recently with Palestine. This leaves the two final demographics which make up the left, which we will analyze in the next two sections independently, those being women and the bureaucracy. Part 3. The philosophy of power. The entirety of leftist philosophy is built on its most fundamental level by the idea of the blank slate, the noble savage, and the open view of humanity. These three ideas are actually the same thing, or that human nature is good by its natural form, and that social conditioning makes us bad. The lesson here that we really need to learn as a society is that the seemingly nerdy argument here about stuff like human nature can determine literally everything else about how you live your life. Philosophy matters a tremendous amount for everything. I used to not believe that, but I see it more and more every day, since your soul informs what you do with your life. As Steven Pinker said, the natural endpoint of the blank slate is that if human nature is naturally perfect, and how you engineer people determines everything, then totalitarianism is the immediate next logical point, given you need to perfectly engineer the perfect conditions to turn humans into saints. This idea is foundational to literally the entirety of the left. They view the human soul like a semiconductor chip that you rip apart and engineer to perfection, while it's really a garden that you have to gradually cultivate. The great irony is that literally no one with a scientific background believes these underlying assumptions of the left today. We live in this strange zombie culture, probably due to aging, in which everything is based upon the assumptions of the World War II era and the one that came right after, whether or not they actually make sense on any level today. Everyone in the sciences at this point believes that human nature is at least half genetic, that genetics informs biological race, sex, and class, which are all real, that human nature is ingrained in our blood as much as it is malleable. This is even what leftists in the sciences now believe. I'm curious to see how this imbalance will be resolved over the next generation or so, either by the left dying out or the left arguing that we need to use genetic engineering to create equality. I could see an ideology like that develop at the end of the 21st century for complex reasons I explain in this text wall. This is going to sound insane, so let me preface it with this. The author of Fire in the Minds of Men was a Princeton professor and a congressional librarian, so about as legit as you could get. This was also a time in which academia was overwhelmingly still left-wing, so not really a conservative bias. He also did a tremendous amount of research on this topic, studying all the founders of the modern left as individuals and seeing their life trajectories. The conclusion he came to is that the modern left came out of the 19th century German occult movement, or the Illuminati, which mixed with French revolutionary ideas. The Illuminati was a secret organization in late 18th century Bavaria. It exists upon a concept of atheism, in which there are no secret underlying truths. The idea was to create a false concept of secret underlying truths so as to create an incentive to get people to push for social equality and a simpler world. A theme that keeps on popping up in the book is that the left's ultimate aim is to push for radical simplicity, to erase differentiations of sex, class, religion, and nationality to make everyone the same. Interestingly, this goes back to Pythagorean philosophy, in which the founders of the early left were obsessed with Pythagoras, who founded a cult based out of mathematical principles in 6th century Italy. Everything the left does is projection, in which the outward mask they wear is the exact opposite of the underlying reality. When the left wants diversity, what they're trying to cover for is to get everyone to cooperate as interchangeable cogs in the machine that is bureaucratic civilization. You're not supposed to find pride in your ethnicity, region, family, community, or religion. Instead, submitting to the managerial global homo, a great term I have a text wall here to explain. To provide cover for this, they push diversity, which is also a weird, truthful psychic withdrawal from said global homo. This again fits the left's strategy of causing a problem, then offering a solution to said problem, which makes the problem worse, and the cycle continues. Get rid of the police. Leftist political thugs replace said police. Remove white people's culture. Blame white people for not having culture, and then give them BIPOC brothers. To get back to that earlier thread, the Illuminati was relatively irrelevant and not the evil mastermind organization that conspiracy theories paint it to be. It was mostly an atheist social club for South German aristocracy and intellectuals. Ironically, the thing the Illuminati did that was the most important was die. In that, out of its collapse came the formation of these different groups that were secret societies in Central Europe, which entered a period of Darwinistic competition, out of which the left came out of. They would combine the occult with political radicalism. This may sound crazy at first, but it makes a lot of sense once you start thinking about it. In that, this was a very religious society in which all educated people knew religious philosophy. Europe was also under the rule of a genuinely oppressive ruling class, which fused the church and state. Thus, to be against the state was also to be against the church. The French Revolution was coordinated through Masonic lodges, since the Masons were explicitly anti-Catholic, and their secret organizational abilities allowed easy coordination from the government secret police. For all these reasons, the idea that the left stems from these occult movements makes a lot of sense, and this is a conclusion from about a dozen different authors who have studied this topic have each independently come to. This is something serious historians agree with. However, I won't say that just because the left was founded by these occult groups, that makes it bad. Modern science is an extension of alchemy, which was largely the same thing, as you could say with Protestantism. There was a time when the Christians were a heretical, outlawed occult group. The major change was that with the Industrial Revolution, which was really the thing that gave the left its legs, turning it from a bunch of silly radicals to the world's dominating ideology, partly by making the world's population majority urban in itself. The Industrial Revolution also created strong incentives towards standardization, social engineering, and technological progress, thus playing into earlier occult beliefs about radical simplification. Hegel studied the occult very deeply, and it seeps into his entire work. He was basically trying to write history in a theological way while pulling from esoteric mysticism. Marx took Hegel's work on its head and flipped it from what was originally completely spiritual or mystic in the Hegelian tradition into completely materialistic. One of the fascinating things about leftist philosophy is that it's basically the only intellectual tradition which is purely materialistic, at least on paper, in that the leftist philosophy rejects the soul or spiritual world in toto. This is important since in a purely materialistic worldview, standards of conduct don't really exist, and the ends naturally justify the means, given moral standards aren't real. Leftist philosophy literally does not believe in a concept of truth. This sounds like a conservative conspiracy theory, but I I've taken a course in gender studies and have read a bunch of books on leftist philosophy. They literally say they believe it in that the powerful can socially construct reality for whatever they believe. In my opinion, the reason the left has such a powerful propaganda arm, focusing on how kind they are, is that when you boil down how they see the world, that's just the underlying principle. When you give people that principle, almost all will reject it. In that, if you ask a normal person, do the people in power determine reality, they're going to say no. And because of that, the left focuses on the external trappings of their worldview, like how kind they are, not the underlying philosophic principles. In fact, you could view our entire society as the desperate attempt to avoid thinking about how stupid our underlying philosophic principles are, as we use hedonism and ideology to never think about it. In leftist philosophy, the most important thing is that you push for the revolution. There's this meme on right-wing Twitter that whenever you talk to the left on any given issue, whether climate change, the economy, racial issues, it's never about the issue, it's really about the revolution. This is something Marx said in his own philosophy, in that in Marxism, philosophy itself is lame since philosophers weren't pushing for the revolution. The rule of life is to push for the revolution, and if a philosopher isn't doing that, he's complicit in the old evil established order. Thus, in leftist philosophy, which lacks an effective metaphysics, the way to be moral is to push for the revolution and its related social agendas. Thus, to be moral in the leftist worldview is to fervently believe whatever is strategically efficient for the left as a movement at that given time. What this results in is the constant virtue signaling and one-upsmanship you see in leftist regimes, whether Mao, Stalin, the French Revolution, or the modern West. Since there are no moral principles, they can't stop themselves anywhere or reset. It's also why they can immediately rationalize any breaking of their own moral codes. Leftism ends up in very stupid places again and again due to this mechanism. One of the things I can never wrap my head around that it's real is that the left will have their elites pick a strategic calculation for power, and then the lower ranks of the elite in future generations of the left will unironically believe these strategic calculations as if they are religious dogma. An example of that is that in the mid-20th century, the left made a very clear strategic decision to emphasize women, ethnic minorities, and gay people. And now the left treats those intersectionalities as sacred, and they have zero self-awareness that in a different timeline, they would have the Jews or the Catholics or the working classes as the demographics they would push. And if you read mid-20th century leftist authors like Saul Alinsky or Gramsci, and Yuri Bezmenov, this is just literally what they say they're doing, that they're picking certain groups to get into power, and they made the strategic decision that the working classes were no longer a demographic which they could use to get power. And the crazy thing is that the leftist elite today completely unironically believes in these things that their elites made as strategic calculations, and there's zero self-awareness involved here that this is all a cynical ploy, and they act as if it's the Bible. I will keep repeating this, but things that sound like conservative propaganda are things the left literally publicly says. In the leftist worldview, the ultimate aim is the seizure of power, and anything can be justified in order to reach that point. I keep seeing conservatives get their panties in a twist about the left being hypocrites. There's this whole tagline in conservative media, what if the roles were reversed? Or conservatives were doing what leftists do. I've just stopped caring. Not being hypocrites isn't a part of their value system, and thus they have no reason to not be hypocrites. They don't give a damn about what if the roles were reversed. They care about winning. I think the Unabomber made the best assessment of the modern left I've seen anywhere. In the anonymous urban world of industrial civilization, where we are all cogs in the machine, it doesn't matter if we're richer, the soul aches at the anonymity and sense of meaninglessness, which was totally alien to the complete enveloping constrictive social conditions of the pre-industrial village. The industrial man works at a job with a boss who doesn't care about him, is surrounded by strangers, and so regulated that he can't change his environment. The Unabomber called this process over-socialization, or the pushing of social pressures to the point where we lose lose our humanity. The left does this, trying to destroy human nature. The Christian theologian C.S. Lewis said around the time of the World Wars that the greatest crimes of the next century would be caused by men sitting behind desks wearing suits, acting out what they believed was good. He also warned of an abolition of man, or an idea that bureaucratic civilization would try to abolish human nature. This is what the left is doing, trying to remove our normal ethnic, national, or sexual identities, tribes, families, communities, social class, tradition, or anything else that makes us us or gives people meaning in life. This is what the left is trying to do, to break human nature through social engineering, driven off their mistaken belief that human nature is perfect. The Unabomber said that this sense of anonymity came from a sense of resentment at over-socialization. This means that the left is a power fantasy made by people who feel powerless. This makes sense since you can almost perfectly correlate lack of agency in real life with leftism. Bureaucrats, professors, or retail or service workers are all very left-wing. These are jobs without agency where the resentment builds up. Furthermore, the left is all about power. They want a dictatorship of the proletariat and don't make a different plan, even though it's failed dozens of times, given they all secretly want to be dictator. You can see that the left is all about power and agitation, since they will always pick the most aggressive strategies to get their goals. They will not be strategic and indirect to push the interests of minorities or their chosen groups. They do so in the most abrasive way possible that's just going to backfire. Every single thing they say gives them more power. Once I realized every single thing the left says is projection as well, my worldview got a lot darker, but at the same time clearer. I suddenly saw that their projections of hate, institutional power, and racism that they shove onto the right are all completely true about them. What the left says about the right is what the left is. If you learn this rule, it's going to save you a bunch of times. One of the most beautiful moments of my life is when I was on Twitter looking at a debate between a leftist woman and a conservative man. I was watching them go at it for a few tweets, and then the leftist woman wrote a criticism of the conservative that was incredibly beautiful because it was such an artistic and intelligent depiction of the flaws in her own argument. I would not be able to write something that poetic if I tried. And seeing the degree of the left's projection makes me believe in the human soul because there is some deep part of people that know what is inherently wrong. With the rise of the Industrial Revolution came the bureaucracy, which is the underlying driving social class behind the left. I've said before in previous videos that the left exists in the modern West to push the self-interests of the college-educated. Every single thing in the leftist worldview comes from the college-educated self-interest. They push for the abolition of the police and the replacement with college-educated social workers. They want to get rid of the military and replace them with college-educated diplomats. They pervert college-educated professors to traditional religions and their priests. They loathe the working classes at this point, while treating the college-educated barista as their target demographic. They push for college-educated managerial bureaucrats in either the government or private enterprise vis-a-vis the entrepreneurs or merchant class. One of the best political books I've ever read is The Leviathan and Its Enemies by Sam Francis. It explains the current ruling class of our society by talking about how, with the world wars, the managerial class gains total dominance over society. He explains everything going on as the bureaucracy's natural attempt to grow at all costs. One of the interesting facets that goes on here is the bureaucracy will pick issues that just physically can't be solved, thus allowing infinite funding for forever. If we're being blunt, the issues in Black ghetto communities, the hysteria of Karens, and the third world's poverty just won't be fixed by bureaucracies, thus allowing infinite bureaucratic bloat. He argues that the reason the left was able to gain social dominance was that since it naturally appeals to the self-interests of the bureaucracy, thus as every single institution becomes run by a bureaucracy, the left was able to gain social control of the upper brass of the military, media, academia, executive branch, educational system, state government, news, religious institutions, and anything else you could imagine. Since power was concentrated in the bureaucracies as the only way to manage an urban society with that technological level, thus those those who ran the bureaucracies had the power. This explains pretty cleanly how Western civilization was taken over completely by suicidal maniacs who hate the civilization itself, because the bureaucracy gets power from dismantling Western civilization. Francis often brings up the Italian thinker Gaetano Mosca, who said that the left selects for the certain class of leadership called foxes. Foxes are clever, wily, and manipulative. They are a kind of people who are good at running complex systems. However, they're bad at using physical force or doing hard things that deal with the real world. It fits into a classic historic pattern in which the empire is built by tough, strong men, but after a few generations, the emperor is an old fool or child, while the court is run by harem girls, eunuchs, and bureaucrats, since those are the kinds of people who are the best at navigating court politics, or the foxes. Then the empire deteriorates, the peasants rebel, or barbarians burn the capital down. I think this is what will happen to our society, as I've said in a dozen other videos, as we are a society run by eunuchs, harem girls, and bureaucrats driving the nation into insanity. The left in its victory has grown weak and stupid. The left won so hard it lost the ability to do anything. They can't wage war, make companies, art, manage government, do law enforcement, develop new ideas. There's not a single recent left-wing author who I admire. 10 years ago, there were plenty, but the left has become decadent and stupid. One of Francis's ideas that I like the best is that you can divide the modern left into the new left and the consensus liberals. The consensus liberals are the Sam Harris, Redditor, rationalist, the science trademarked UN, graph go up, neoliberal types. I can convey their essence in a jumble of words, better than articulated, but I know that you know what I mean. They are the de facto ruling class. Meanwhile, they are in coalition with the New Left. The New Left is Wicca, Mother Goddess, degrowth, reparations, your truth crew. These two look as if they're in opposition, one being rational and the other being intuitive. The reality is that they've been working together as a sort of tag team, playing good cop, bad cop since the World Wars. The consensus liberals pretend to be reasonable, scientific, and a consensus, while the reality is that they artificially stuff the bureaucracies and committees to get whatever they want. Said impersonal processes were supposedly created to bypass the negatives of human nature, while the reality is that they just enable its worst aspects. The consensus liberals use the threat of the new left to keep shuffling the social consensus leftwards. You want to avoid the complete insanity of the new left, so take this reasonable step for progress. This is salami slicing for the left to get total power. The new left is astroturfed as outsiders used to push the regime's interests, given everything the new left pushes for really demands the growth of the managerial class. It's funny how punk rock, rap, and other degenerate chaotic art forms have just become the mainstream so easily. In almost all cases, what the new left sees as progress is the breakdown of traditional social ties or individual responsibility, which is always filled by the state or management. As the society decays and collapses, the bureaucracy fills the void. Part 3. The abdication of responsibility. This leads into a topic which totally deserves to be its own video, given it taps into the most deep and fundamental part of human or animal nature, a split which goes back nearly 1 billion years, that between men and women. This is literally the most taboo thing to talk about in society, which just proves the point in of itself. You know who's in power by who you're not allowed to criticize. And I frankly think a big reason rightist discourse is so obsessed with the Jews is that they're scared of blaming women. We've reached a point recently in the divide between male and female has become a inherently political divide amongst young people, in that 3-to-1 young men are conservative and the reverse is true for young women. The question I have here is, how the hell are they supposed to start families together and have kids if they're fundamentally different religions or civilizations? If we told any pre-industrial society that the great political divide inside our society was men versus women, they would be in complete shock. The idea that women could push their own interests would appear insane by historic standards. For a real historic example, the Greek writer Aristophanes in the 4th century BC wrote the play Assemblywoman. It was about a society where only women voted, kicking men out of the franchise. The result of an all-female electorate was that women voted in economic communism, the end of privacy in the nuclear family. Beyond that, the women and voted in sexual communism in which there was free love, but in order to sleep with a beautiful woman, you had to sleep with an ugly one first. The female senators would complain about how difficult being a senator was on the Senate floor, how cold the room was, and they had trouble forming a coherent strategy to carry out their plans. Doesn't this sound awfully familiar? It feels like the Greeks knew something profound about human nature that we've forgotten. If you give women authority due to their own biological self-interests, they will end up pushing certain policies that end up looking a lot like the modern left. Winston Churchill, when asked if he supported women's suffrage, said that if you gave women suffrage, it would become the starting point for a series of social issues that were ridiculous that would immediately be championed forever without stop. John Adams, when asked about women's suffrage, said the exact same thing, that society would devolve into pushing silly political projects for greater equality. Firstly, this happens in the industrial world, but not in previous societies to anywhere the same degree, due to the industrial world removing men's advantages in physical strength, and the last feminist wave came about due to women being liberated from sex being immediately associated with childbirth. The real question to ask here is what in female nature meant that an ancient Greek author could predict leftism 2,500 years in advance. An interesting thread that I need to make a video about at some point is that the ancient Greeks did have their own versions of socialism and feminism. Athens at the time of Plato or Pericles treated women like the Taliban does today. Within a century, women got legal equality with men, while Greece saw waves of communist and socialist movements. The reason America's founding fathers were so careful about mob rule and the faults of democracy is that they studied the precedent of Greek socialism very closely. The most important difference between men and women is that men get benefit from risk and women don't. Men wage war, hunt, go on trading expeditions, while women are weighed down firstly by childbearing and are also just physically weaker. In game theory terms, this creates very different incentives. For men, it's the formation of systems in which men can excel through doing stuff to make themselves more attractive as mates. For women, it's to mitigate risk as much as humanly possible. This is why female voters push for welfare, the breakdown of the family, war, capitalism, and other things. In each of these cases, they're removing things that can be bad. You could have a bad husband, the military could turn against you, or your company could fail. The thing with government welfare is that no matter how you screw up, the government will still support you and your offspring. This is why there is a relatively close correlation between welfare and feminism over history. The purpose of the left is complete risk mitigation for the individual in this manner. The state does everything for you, so no matter what, you'll be fine. This explains almost all of the left, the attempt to escape responsibility. An important point that modern civilization never makes is that the human experience is largely lived through individual consciousness, in that things like nations and groups form, but it's formed by the individual consciousness. And so things that are really questions just about human life itself have important ramifications for society itself. And the left is resentful that we are born into a world of suffering where you have to actually do things to survive. And thus, in a very childlike form, they just rebel against that and the idea that you have to struggle in life. There's another fascinating divide that the right versus left divide is very much R versus K selection. R selection is you make short-term decisions to have as many children as possible evolutionarily and just hope they survive while giving them very low investment. And K selection is high investment, long-term. And R selection does better in more chaotic societies where if you're in this bloodthirsty tribal culture, you'll just try to sleep with as many women as possible and hope they survive, while in a more industrialized, more educated culture, you need to put more investment in your children. And the left pushes things like abortion. It pushes low emphasis on getting values. It pushes low emphasis on marriage, cultural traditions, all these things that further K selection, while the right is the opposite. Another interesting element here is that we've consistently found from SAW, or an acronym I invented for Studies in Ancient Wisdom, is that women are just as aggressive as men. They just put that aggression into interpersonal relationships. This occurs through GSR, or gossiping, shaming, and rallying, that being female relational warfare. If you look at what the left does, they always smear their enemies and make their enemies socially unpalatable. They've been doing this to the right for decades. Leftism is GSR on a continental industrial scale. For an easy example of this, the left criticizes me for being a pseudo-intellectual, incel, autistic, egomaniacal, deranged, schizophrenic, broke, loser, fascist Nazi. None of those are true, and for many of those, the reality is the exact opposite, but that doesn't matter one whit. What matters to them is that they made me look low status and thus not worth listening to. It's the political version of a mean girl saying you look fat today. The left are the best people in the world at playing verbal games. They won in a world where everyone was so wealthy that appearing popular trounced actual survival. What Moscano said is correct, that the kinds of people in the leftist elite are the same sort of people who are cunning but not tough. They can only control the population through psychological manipulation. This is why they use schools, academia, the media, and all other types of manipulation in order to control the population from the cradle. This is why they responded to Trump with an insane bout of shaming and trying to make him look terrible. If the left is screeching at you, that's a good sign. It means they're scared. The reason women use GSR is they can't use physical force. The left is a fascinating historic moment. I think thousands of years from now, people will be shocked that it ever existed. I think the left will be remembered in the far future how we look at the bizarre Christian theological conflicts which occurred around the time of the Dark Ages. Wait, people actually killed each other over what aspect of Christ's divinity existed at the very moment he was resurrected. It makes perfect sense to us now since we're stuck here, but the left's denial of reality itself inside their own worldview is just bonkers. I don't know how else to say this, but once you dig to the bottom of the left's worldview, they're just wrong. In future eras of history, we're going to learn these lessons, and they'll ask us, hey, why didn't you immediately ask the left what their view on human nature and the world was, and when they didn't give you a good answer, why didn't you immediately call them out? They would think about us, you guys were so scared of looking nerdy that you completely sold out your society to insane people. The powerful just don't construct reality in their image. Human nature just isn't perfectible. The state won't fix all of our issues. People just can't completely abdicate responsibility. The fact that we let Marxists take over our civilization twice, after the previous round killed a little less than 100 million people, is just insane. I've been reading Solzhenitsyn lately, and he's one of the best authors I've ever read, although it's so depressing it's hard to read. And the biggest thing I can't forgive the left for is just the sheer pettiness. Solzhenitsyn writes about how communists would starve someone for a month, leaving food in front of them without letting them eat it, torturing people like a mouse plays with a cat, enjoying the suffering, interviewing someone about a friend who was sent to the gulag, asking them about every single thing they said in their casual conversations. If you say the wrong word, you're dead. Even if you do it all right, they could kill you anyway. This is something I see with the leftists today. We choose to ignore our own danger. We can choose to see the left for their pretty face or what's under the hood.